Lately, we've been seeing a lot of historical revisionism regarding the Wii U, so it is high time that we set the record straight. That the Wii U was a huge success, that it vastly outperformed the PS4 and the Xbox One, that it set the stage for the Switch to kind of sweep the entire gaming industry uncontested. The Wii U walked so the Switch could run, essentially. Like, the Switch is essentially a revision of the Wii U with a lot of the same games, with a lot of the same concepts, a lot of the same mechanics. In fact, Iwata actually like confirmed this, that the concept of the Switch being a portable device came from the Wii U and how people would take their consoles out in public and play games with the tablet. So that became the basis for the Switch. That's what inspired the console. That's what led them down this path. Like, without the Wii U, the Switch could not exist. So with that in mind, what exactly happened during the Wii U generation? What actually happened? Because everyone always loves to scream about sales numbers. This thing sold like 13 million units. And they always love to say the console failed or that it bombed or that it did not live up to market expectations. But the reality is the Wii U had a wide range of highly successful games that were very easily ported over to the next generation Nintendo console. So the Wii U was able to introduce Mario Kart 8, huge hit on Wii U, and then it was ported over to Switch, and not only became the best-selling game ever made, but also continued to get like a lot of DLC and a lot of updates, and stayed relevant up until Mario Kart World's release. Essentially, the Wii U, to put it very, very simply, it was the console generation that truly defined that Nintendo exclusives were better than the competition. Because any one of us who like bought a Wii U and got to play like, say, Assassin's Creed 4 or Watch Dogs or Arkham City, like those of us who played those games on our Nintendo console were very quick to realize that games like Nintendo Land, like New Super Mario Bros. U, Pikmin 3, The Wonderful 101, Super Mario 3D World, all of these were way better than the AAA slop that were being played on other consoles, right? No longer was there a cope that like third-party games were somehow bigger and better than Nintendo games. This was the end, honestly. Like, I don't think it's a coincidence that like Assassin's Creed 4 is the last time that like Assassin's Creed was ever relevant, because that was the game that came out on Wii U. Like, when we played that game and we realized how sloppy it was, how bad the combat was, how the game just wasn't very good at all, like, what ends up happening is that, like, people slowly, gradually began to turn on the third parties, who traditionally, throughout, like, the the PS1, PS2, and PlayStation 3 generations, the PlayStation 360 generation, they were always hyped up as, like, the biggest and the best in the industry. The AAA devs, like, they look realistic. The graphics, bro, they're so mature. Like, the Wii U was the beginning of that era dying. But it wasn't dead yet, Like, people were fighting to keep it alive for as long as possible. That 2013 was the year that brought us, like, The Last of Us, BioShock Infinite, Grand Theft Auto 5. Some of the sloppiest slopped that's ever been slopped, right? Absolute garbage. But it was kind of the end of an era. Because over the next several years, we saw the rise of series like Tamagotchi Life. We saw the rise of games like Fire Emblem Awakening. We saw like Kid Icarus Uprising be downplayed and then become a cult classic. We saw the success of the 3DS and how that completely buried the Vita to the point where PlayStation no longer has a handheld division. We saw over and over again Nintendo win while the other companies slowly began to fail. I was predicting the gaming crash as early as 2015 because I was seeing how companies like From Slopware could put out a critically acclaimed game like Bloodborne and have it sell only 2 million units, while games like New Super Mario Bros. U do like significantly better than that, and got a Switch port and continue to sell after that. New Super Mario Bros. U has sold like 25 million units. And that was a game that people initially wrote off as a failure. Like that's a very good example of just how enduring a lot of these Wii U games have actually been. That like a lot of them are still very, very relevant all these years later. In fact, Breath of the Wild, one of the most critically acclaimed, influential games ever that still hasn't been topped in a lot of ways, that was a Wii U game. Like the Switch version was just a port. So essentially, what you have is this like industry-defining console that stomped the PlayStation, stomped the Xbox, established Nintendo as the dominant force in gaming, and what you've been seeing is like the fallout from that. Okay. Like after the Wii U generation, after the third party started to fail, after like the bottom started falling off on their strategy of just hyping up whatever was coming out, like we saw more and more that Nintendo strategies of keeping lower budget games on weaker hardware was far more effective. What we ended up seeing is that not only were Nintendo games outperforming the competition, they were staying relevant for way longer. They were being sold at full price. They were continuing to do numbers years after the fact, and they would consistently put out new games. Like it is insane when you look at like Nintendo's release schedule compared to like say Take-Two's or Rockstar's or like any of these other like big companies, you know, like they don't really do anything, you know, like Overwatch is a really good example of this because the narrative when Overwatch came out was that like, oh, it's this colorful shooter, it's doing all this, like there's nothing else like it on the market. Splatoon came out a year before, you know, it had a way more unique presentation, a way more unique vibe, and over the past decade, Overwatch has slowly become gay and irrelevant. Like nobody cares about Overwatch anymore. Okay, the only people who were playing Overwatch at the time were Blizzard's brainwashed shills who were just obsessed with the company and everything it does. Splatoon, in comparison, has done much more modest numbers, but it has actually built up a genuine fan base and a developer that is constantly evolving and growing the brand. Like, it is not unprecedented to think that, like, Splatoon at some point is going to have some major explosion in relevancy, you know, surpassing slop like Overwatch, surpassing slop like COD, like Fortnite, like all of this garbage, and you know, all from relatively modest beginnings. Like, it is important to note that a lot of these third-party games, like, they're super relevant at the time, but like they get completely mogged by Nintendo later. You know, Skyrim is a very good example. You know, it's seen as like a cultural phenomenon. It's seen as one of the best games ever made. It was seen as this huge deal, this huge open world RPG. Not only have we never gotten Skyrim 2, Zelda came out, Breath of the Wild came out. It did very, very well for itself. You know, improved on the formula, was way better than Skyrim every way, and it got a sequel. And it got successful spinoffs, and it has like successful other projects in the pipeline. You know, Bethesda in comparison peaked with Skyrim, and this then just kind of collapsed afterward. And that's kind of what we saw with the PS4 and the Xbox One. The narrative was that Nintendo was failing with the Wii U era, that they couldn't compete, that they couldn't stay relevant. But in actuality, it was PlayStation and Xbox that couldn't compete. Because after the Wii U era, instead of having this massive head start and this massive fan base from like the previous generation, what we saw with the PS5 and the Series X, especially with the Series X, with the Xbox, was this complete and total drop-off in relevancy, where nobody talks about them, nobody plays any of these games, and there's been this massive push to shift over to PC, because like the consoles are just seen as being these like wastes of space that don't really add anything to the experience. Like, Nintendo won the console war, and a big reason for that was because of the Wii U. Because of how in this like in their absolute darkest hour, with like, you know, the entire industry rallying against them, trying to destroy them, trying to drive them out of business, like nothing could be done to stop them at all. You know, even with these like low sales numbers, like the absolute like worst possible numbers they could have had, they still ended up beating the competition and still ended up putting out great games, building their audience, and putting out the Nintendo Switch, which is the kind of the coup de grace of the situation. Because when you took away like the low sales numbers of the Wii U, there really was no denying that it absolutely was the best console that generation. Like, there was no denying that Nintendo was the better brand. And that's what we've been seeing over the past decade, is just normies slowly starting to like pull themselves out of the Wii era conspiracies that like the Wii was only popular with the casual gamers and women. and going to like the next stage where like they're just kind of like desperately trying to hold out hope that like the next Nintendo console will fail, or that consumers will turn on them like they did back in the 2000s. And what these people don't understand is why people turned on Nintendo back at that point. And it was entirely because of Sony propaganda. You know, without Sony actively funding all of this Nintendo cope, this idea that like Nintendo is for kids, or that like they fell off in the 80s or what have you, like without all of that, like they really truly genuinely have nothing going for them. You know, that's the reality of it. And that's why so much of these Nintendo hate channels seem so schizophrenic. You know, why people like Nintendine are seriously like sitting there every day and making conspiracy videos about Furukawa and like Doug Bowser and like the Switch 2. Like, it's because they can't really rationalize why Nintendo is successful, because in their minds nothing has changed. In their minds, Nintendo is like the same as they were in the Wii U era, and that they should be failing right now. But the reality is that like they're right, like nothing has changed, but they were succeeding during the Wii U era. You know, there's more to success than simply seeing monetary gain immediately. Okay, they were setting the foundation. They were establishing the future. They were establishing what the Switch, which I think is going to be seen as like one of the all-time great Nintendo innovations ever. You know, like they were setting the foundation for that. Okay, they were establishing like the brand and establishing like, you know, branching out into multimedia, you know, beginning to branch out into making other pieces of hardware like Alarmo, you know, like they're making toys, they're making t-shirts, they have their own store that you can buy things from. Like Nintendo is killing it right now. And at this stage, there is this very stubborn refusal from the community to acknowledge it. Like they are desperate to downplay this company no matter what happens. No matter how much money they make, no matter how many units they sell, in their eyes, the Switch 2 is just another Wii U. And to them, that means it's a failure. But in reality, that means the Switch 2 is a success.